when I walk out there, though, even though I know it's solid, I'll tell you, the grant is about 18 miles.
Six o'clock. All right. We're going to go ahead and begin tonight's meeting. So happy holidays, everybody. Hope you all have a good holidays and Happy New Year. So actually, before we get started, can I get a quick sound check for those joining online?
I definitely can hear you, Kwong. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome to the January 2026 RAB meeting for the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant. My name is Quan Nguyen, and I'm with the U.S. Army Environmental Command. And also with the U.S. Army Environmental Command is our Public Affairs Officer, Ms. Lali Laxberg, who is joining us online. So it's good to see everyone here for this meeting. I think the last meeting we had was back in July of last year. And as always, the Army appreciates the community's interests and support of the cleanup at the Badger Army Ammunition Plant and the dedication of your RAB members. So, okay. So here is the agenda for tonight's meeting. This agenda was distributed to the RAB members last week, or actually on December 12th. And the first one will be the roll call. So reminder, if you have not signed in for tonight's meeting that you're here in person, please do so. The sign-up sheet is located out front. And for those joining online, we will also be tracking your attendance as well. For the meeting minutes from the July 2025 RAB meeting, we distributed that out back in December, incorporating all the applicable comments that we received. And we appreciate your comments. One of the comments that we've got was making the Word document more editable for you guys to make it easier for you guys to review and make comments on it. So we will be very mindful of that moving forward for any future submittals of the meeting minutes. With that being said, if no one else has any questions on the July 2025 RAB meeting minutes, we can go ahead and make that as the final version. All right, seeing none or hearing none, we will proceed with that. The next agenda will be the groundwater sampling update. SpecPro, who is the Army's cleanup contractor, will be providing the groundwater analytical results from the June, August, September, and November 2025 sampling events. And then the next topic will be the groundwater sampling plan. As we provided to you a brief presentation back in the previous RAB meetings, the Army has been developing a groundwater sampling plan as part of our efforts to periodically reviewed and update the groundwater sampling efforts based on the current data and the data trends. I will also be providing an update on all the various cleanup projects that is currently taking place at Badger. And last but not least, we have the U.S. Geological Survey subject matter experts here with us tonight that will be presenting the groundwater transport study that they have been working on in support of the Army's cleanup efforts. I will pause there if anybody has any questions on tonight's agenda. No? All right, thank you. So for this welcoming remarks slides, just a reminder that the RAB co-chairs for the Badger is Ms. Michelle Hobbs, who represent the town of Merrimack? Village, I'm sorry, my bad. And myself representing the Army. And I understand that Michelle didn't have any planned opening remark for tonight's meeting, but you're more than welcome to add anything if you think of.
I just always want to encourage people to ask questions. That's all I have.
Great, thank you. And from the Army side, just want to again mention, as most of you guys already know or aware, that the federal government had a shutdown for 43 days back in October 1st of last year to mid-November due to the lapse of federal funding. So, and also during that time, unfortunately, the Midwest team also has one less employee who left the agency. So with all that being said, is that we appreciate you being patient with us while we are continuing to catch up with our projects, and we will try our best to answer any of your questions on a timely manner. So the first agenda tonight is going to be the groundwater sampling update. Joel, you want to step in? You have a control with the mouse, okay.
All right, good evening. So since we haven't had a meeting in a while, there's quite a few rounds to cover. So we've got quarterly sampling that we're doing, so we're going to update on June, and then August is like the annual residential well sampling, and then September and November. So the only thing we're missing in this entire list is April, and we had already provided an update on the April results, I think in the July meeting. So sorry, there's a lot of information, and plus the sampling update. So June is mostly about the central plume, and then we have some residential wells, and we're going to have a few slides after this one. This isn't the only one. And then, so we had 64 residential wells in August, which has been our typical sampling plan in the past. We are going to have a slide updating on what that's going to be in the future. And then September is the standard with the NC plume. The NC plume is up on the left-hand corner. That's the smallest plume up there showing. And then the deterrent burning ground plume is the one on the upper right. That's the one that goes off towards Wiggins Bay down in the bottom there. And then the propellant burning ground plume, which goes down to below the dam. And then November is a subsidiary where there's some more wells that get tested down by the Water's Edge subdivision and in the central plume. So talking about some results from the June central plume sampling. So I drew a line up here, and so the D&T is total D&T for any of the 6 isomers, and the enforcement standard for that is 0.05 micrograms per liter. So I got that listed down on the bottom, And then .005 is the PAL, which is something to take a look at. So the enforcement standard is what the Army said that we would clean up to. If anyone was here for any proposed plan discussions in the past January. So at the moment, if we were looking at remediation, the current wells that we have showing from June is this dividing line across in green. So everything below of all the wells that were tested going down into the water's edge are currently this year below the enforcement standard. So as you know, the remediation is going to happen this year. It's probably a ways out. So more testing, will determine when the remediation does happen, where remediation would go. But so it is very positive from the long-term effect of this plume has had D&T above the enforcement standard down in the water's edge area because 3 residential wells had been replaced. So we still have elevated concentrations up in the very northern end of the plume, which would be closer to where any of the source area was. So very good D&T decreases. I'd like to see that continue again in the next year. I do have some wells that we're looking at installing when we get to the sampling plan. So I will show some of that in the future. So residential well testing is done up in Wiggins Bay area, up by the deterrent burning ground plume up here, and then down at the end of the central plume, down by Water's Edge and Gruber's Grove Bay, and then the propellant burning ground plume, and then the plant boundary is right here on this red line going across. And so we do have a couple exceedances that are shown. There are carbon tet concentrations right on the plume edge, right across from the boundary, and a couple residential wells where we're monitoring that carbon tetrachloride. And we have received a request to increase the sampling of those 2 wells from annually to semi-annual by the DNR. And then there's chloroform detection in the water's edge. That area has had D&T detections. This round we did not have any D&T detections in any residential wells. For September, just specifically with the deterrent burning ground plume. So pretty much out there, if there's a well associated with it, it was sampled in this round. So we're covering a large area. We do these wells semi-annually. The source area at the deterrent burning ground plume is up at the top, and everyone can see my red dot as I'm moving around. Okay, just thought I'd make sure I'm doing that a lot. So, so up here is the source area where the deterrent burning ground was located. That is capped. There is a well. I can't read the exact concentration there. Okay, there it is. Okay, it's a 3.084, I believe. So this well right here is right next to where the cap is. That is a higher concentration we had seen last year. But the overall numbers throughout the plume down gradient of there have decreased. And in fact, anything past the boundary, there's a well nest right here. We've seen major decreases in that in the last 5 years. So there is a residential well that had been replaced nearby. That's now a bedrock well. But we have only 1 well there that has anything of concern at the moment. We did have a new well nest installed, and that well nest right here is showing on the edge of the plume, and we have not detected D&T there, so we know that the plume hasn't migrated anywhere in that direction. We have been focusing on this area of the plume. We still are monitoring these wells to the south down here. They're labeled ELN 100 series, and we're still showing that the D&T has not moved down into this area, in the southern area towards the bottom finger of Wiggins Bay. And I do have a little note here I forgot. There was a well replaced recently. It's ELN 2501A. There was a well there that the screen had been collapsed and we've been unable to sample it. So we were able to get funding in last year to replace this shallow well. And then we were able to sample it in September and it was clean. Even though it says it's in the plume, we'll have to get further information to verify if there is no more D&T in that well nest. And now just the nitrocellulose plume. We just have 7 wells currently. We are still showing. Oh.
I have a question again that's raised on the previous slide. This is Laura.
Do you want me to go back?
Yes.
Is that what you're, I don't know.
Yes. Just a couple things I wanted to share. Looking at, if you look at the, I think it's S1121 down on the southern boundary there, and there was in 2019, there was soil testing done, and D&T was detected there in the low levels in that. And then underneath, do you have a slide that has the neighborhood on it?
Yeah, I actually have a slide for that in a couple slides about the plan. Would you be willing to wait until that one, Laura?
That'd be great.
Is that okay? Yeah,
That isn't on there, so thank you.
okay, I'll bring it up when we get to that next slide. Yeah, we already were looking at your email, Laura, so. Okay. So we have 3 wells within the plume that are showing enforcement standard exceedances for total D&T within the nitrocellulose plume. And this is in the area where the powder or nitrocellulose pellets was generated. And so there's a lot of production buildings within this area. We are finding like just 2,4 and 2,6 D&T in this area. We do have some planned wells that we're going to show you for this plume. As you might see that there's a plume down here, but there are no wells. There is contamination in this far northern well, but we don't have any wells to the north at the moment. So that's part of the new plan discussion. So 0.117, that is twice the enforcement standard. And this is a plume that is currently staying on site at the moment. So the propellant burning ground plume in September, we just had 80 wells. This year in September, there's going to be at least 20 or 30 more with the new plan. So a lot more samples in various areas moving around. So from D&T's perspective, we just have 16 wells, and all of those wells are located from near the plant boundary up towards the source. So a lot more D&T by the source. Some with just the PAL exceedance. Waste pits, so actually this number is lower than the determined burning ground number. So I said that it was 3 point something at the determined burning ground. The lowest or the highest concentration here is 2.6 near the waste pits, which is lower than it has been in the past. The water table is still lower than it had been, so we don't have that issue where the water table rose up and we had more D&T come out south of the waste pits. But so this is still, quite above the enforcement standard, and this is still the area that any remediation would take place for D&T. We still have carbon tet above the enforcement standard within the on-site portion of the plume and off-site. So down on Highway 78 across from like where the Culver's office is, that we still have carbon tet exceeding down there. And there's a well off-site just south that we still have carbon tet exceeding. And then ethyl ether. So we still have this exceedance that we've been tracking here for the last couple of years. It's 9103D. It's on County Z between 12 on the left and then Highway 78. That is a very deep well. It's just above the bedrock area. Concentration is stable, but still above 1,000 parts per billion, which is the enforcement standard. Yep. Okay, is it about this slide?
She didn't write it, she just had her hand raised, and so.
Okay.
I was just wondering, with the settling ponds area, is part of the investigation of the residual explosives in soils, is there going to be groundwater monitoring as part of that same investigation beyond what's there right now? Is it unknown?
At the moment, we still have to do a CERCLA remedial investigation of the soils. And so that process does involve risk, and is there any risk related to impacts to groundwater, which is a standard thing that you have to do. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Okay, so now it's the sampling plan. So I know it's still going to talk about the plumes, but any other questions on just some of the data? If you don't have a question figured out yet, maybe you will by the time we go through some of the sampling plan of each plume. So I just wanted to see if anyone else had any questions. Nothing else yet online? Okay. All right, so we had submitted a very detailed sampling plan. It has been quite a few years since there was such a plan at all for all of the Badger work. January 6th, we did get some comments back from Luke and the DNR regarding what we had submitted as a draft. We are going to work on a response. We did discuss that over, and we'll have a formal response worked out to the DNR, and then it'll be the final plan. So as the majority of the plan that we had, if you had read that very long document, the majority of it will be staying as is. So pretty much he's asking for some other possible things. I had already mentioned semi-annual testing, a couple residential wells in the propellant burning ground. But as it stands, most of the information we had submitted, they were found acceptable. So as far as the central plume, we are going to add a couple wells within the middle of the plume that are existing, that are shallow, within way up in inside of the plant. We are going to continue the residential well testing that we've been doing for now in the water's edge, and we also do the USDA farm wells. So they have 4 wells that they operate. One of them is for cattle, which is back on site, and then they have 3 wells down by the current farm to operate high capacity for like their cattle and stuff on site. And then all the residential wells down in the Water's Edge subdivision are currently still listed as annual. And then one of the wells that has a D&T history is still going to be quarterly for now. So we are still looking at the majority of this plume is D&T. Just in the southern area is where we're looking for the VOCs. So chloroform. Otherwise, we're not finding any VOCs further up north in the plume. We are looking to still put 2 wells in on the east and west side shown here to help bound the plume. The DNR has asked us in the past to put some wells in to verify where this plume boundary is with some monitoring wells. So we're actually trying to find cleaner water. So we're not looking for any dirty water within the middle of the plume. But this is definitely something that we're considering sooner than later. So they're going to be a B and C. So B is where we replaced a lot of the wells in the past, those 3 residential wells I mentioned. That was about the B well. That was about 100 feet deep if you're down in that subdivision. So first level we're looking for there. That's where we had the worst case scenario with D and T before. And then we're going to go C, which is deeper, in case there's any that sunk down a little bit further. So that might be closer to 180 feet at the most, maybe 170 feet deep. So a lot of residential wells are still at 100 feet in the subdivision, and some of them were drilled deeper, and then there's just a few wells that are in the bedrock that for the homes. So we're still trying to mimic if there is something coming, like if the plume has migrated at all further towards these residential wells, towards the east and the river, we would be able to see if that's in the monitoring well. But we are still continuing to test all these wells annually. Any questions on the central plume? Okay. So the deterrent burning ground plume, there's not any wells here that we aren't going to test anymore. We're going to change the frequency a little bit of some of the wells. I had mentioned that offsite, there's a nest here. We had been sampling that well nest quarterly. There were 4 wells there. We're going to only sample them semi-annually, so twice a year. The risk of that area is much less. The home has been replaced with a clean well. The concentrations are dropping. So we're not quite as concerned right in this area. But the new well that's out here is going to stay quarterly. So that is in the direction of any residences down here. This is Walsh's Bay. There's it's a one owner owns most of this property over here, and there's a lot of Sandpoint wells. So we're still going to sample these 3 wells here, plus we're monitoring this well quarterly and this other residential well up here quarterly to if there is something coming in their direction. So we want to make sure we're monitoring that area. And then we're going to keep the residential or the monitoring wells to the south here. We're going to keep testing those to make sure that there is no issue further south. But most of it's going to be a very similar backup in the site, all the same, twice a year, D&T, and test for VOCs also. So the next slide is where Laura had a question specifically about the 2009 sampling. Correct, Laura?
Yes,
Okay.
and then some testing that was done in 2024, but you go first.
No, that's fine. So Laura had requested from the Army some, and the DNR, I think Luke was also copied, about a 2009 investigation that the Army did specifically in the deterrent burning ground plume. So we hired a driller to take individual core samples through a barrel, and then there was an inner lining through, and we collected groundwater samples as they were drilling down with a pump. And then we had to like decon and go back in. So we did not take any soil samples. We just went to the water table and then took vertical samples like we would if you were doing on one of our wells. So you start at the water table, then you go down every, I don't know if it was 20 or 30 feet, and then you keep going further. And so in that report, there were detections of DNT shown, and Laura had some questions about some sampling results that were found in some monitoring wells down here where we're showing there's no DNT plume. And there was 2 wells, residential wells, that had detections, and those were just regular samples from homes in 2009. So I want to caveat, the investigation was, it was successful in some ways and unsuccessful in the other. I remember doing the investigation, and it was successful in that we were able to determine that there was DNT moving off-site. So at that time, we did not have all these monitoring wells off-site, and so we were able to then tell the Army, we need to look off-site. And so we drilled wells down here on-site, and we drilled wells up into the plume that you can't see on this map where we were been finding DNT. And so we finally were able to start looking off-site, and so that kind of increased the sampling program in 2010. So we installed a whole bunch of monitoring wells in 2010 after this investigation. And so it was really helpful to try to improve this off-site plan, looking for where the plume could be. The downside of the investigation was that the cleaning or the accuracy of some of the low detections of DNT were questionable, unfortunately. So the detections, when I went back and looked at what I was looking at, was we had some clean samples between the plume and these wells down here. And it brought in a lot of questions about, was this really, this one-time sampling, how good was it? And it was not very high detections. The detections that were really high were back up in the plume. And so next year we went out, put monitoring wells in the same spot where we had some of these results, and we haven't had a problem since. So we have been testing, though there's 2 wells that were down here, and those wells have been tested since 2009 every year up through this year in 2025, plus all the other wells by Wiggins Bay. We had 1 detection in 2012 in a couple of the wells, and there was 1 minor detection in 2015 in a well, but there's nothing repeatable since. But I'll let Laura ask some, I assume she has some more questions before if I go any further. So go ahead, Laura.
You mentioned a couple of wells that were tested in 2012 and then 15. If you could, like after the speeding, send it out to the RAB members, so we would, sorry.
Yeah, it is, it's this table within the sampling plan. So yeah, we can clip out from one of the pages, because we tried to provide a summary of this information within the plan. And then I know I submitted some other thing, Luke had some more detailed stuff. So the database is obviously that's either online or that we have are extremely lengthy and detailed, but has all of the data going back through the last 15 to 20 years of all the residential sampling or every monitoring well sampling in this area. So it's very, for certain people, it's easy to just pick, oh, okay, you're looking for all of these and you look for any detections. And so I did do a detection list for the last, 15, 17 years, and there's only been a few detections in all the residential wells. So what we're getting to is that we are looking at this yellow box. There's 19 residential wells that we have been testing for, since 2007, and the amount of detections for DNT are so small and not repeatable. There's no source of DNT coming from Badger for this area. It's all seems to be moving up in this area. So at the time of that investigation, everything seems to be moving more towards the northern part of Wiggins Bay. So from what we can tell with our monitoring, with the fact that the residential well that was up here had D&T and had to be replaced. So we have not found anything in the lower area. So there was some VOC detections in the past from TCE pumps, we think. So we had done an investigation where we found some people had some jet pumps. And some jet pumps had TCE in them from when they were manufactured. And so we would go to the same well and, you know, it's like, oh, they have TCE, okay. And then we went to some wells up here at Walsh's Bay, and we had sampled all those, and we pulled the pump, sampled, and there's no TCE in the water, but it was in the pump as soon as you connected it. So this has happened in a couple areas else that we've noticed where we've had the same issue down in Gruber's Grove Bay. So if you looked at history, we have had some minor detections in this area for TCE, but we don't have any TCE coming from Badger. So there's no plume, because we sample VOCs continuously in the plume up gradient. So I wanted to point out there was some VOC detections in the past from these wells. So we did provide all that data within the sampling plan.
If you look up, I think it's the north line plant boundary, there's ELN 1001 BC&E, and the data I was looking at, this is 2024, DNT was detected at all 3 levels in that monitoring well nest. And if you look at the arrow, which is the approximate groundwater flow direction, or the water table, based on the water table, so it was those together with the further to the south, that soil boring. I know that was just the one that you said. So the other thing I'm wondering about too is the plume itself, because the water table closer to the equity turn burning ground area, you know, it's so flat there, it doesn't take much of a difference in the water table to affect the groundwater flow direction. So to me, it's not as static as other areas of plant where it's in glacial outwash, for example, as opposed to, I think, one of the consultants described it as a twisted bun cake that returned burning grounds. So I still have a problem at this point, really feeling confident that there's not. I think the fact that it was detected in 2 drinking water wells, let's see, 2009. So I don't know what's happened since then, or if it's been detected again. Did you do, and I think one of our neighbors also, you tested their well voluntarily, or we're talking about it? Did that ever happen, or was anything found?
Oh, in the Wiggins Bay area?
Yeah, not too far from where.
Oh, no. No, there wasn't. Yeah, that's right around the corner from you. No, we didn't find anything in that well. That was a new well that was drilled.
Right. So, and it was tested for VOCs and DNT?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I just have a general, then one other thing I want to say too on what's going on there is I'm thinking ahead to when these injections into groundwater might happen, and the potential to mobilize PFAS if it's present. I know the town of Merrimack sent in comments to Army about potential to mobilize metals, and of course DMPs is going to have an impact. That's the whole plan. It seems like there's so many variables. So I think it's too early. I don't think we should, I think it needs to be consistent before we go, if those injections happen, and then during and then after. So I'm concerned about not having continuity in data before, during, and after the pilot test and the full-scale implementation. Because I think that's just going to be too difficult to guesstimate. I want us to have data. You follow me?
Yeah, I mean, when those injections take place, they would be up to the north, where the plume is up on the north end, away from Highway 78. And there would definitely be monitoring of any monitoring wells or other points during the injections that would be added to make sure that there wasn't any mobilization of anything within several hundred feet of that. So I know we have a residential well that we're quarterly sampling right up here, and so that one I've made sure that that was top priority for anything, because that well is fairly shallow, so you want to make sure that anything you've learned, any experience, and you don't start next to that area. So if you're going to do any remediation, you learn something before you get out to any residential wells. Yeah, as far as I would say, as far as the sampling plan, if there is something that is consistent, statistically relevant, that we find that we know that there's like a new thing going on down in the southern area with D&T, we're gonna automatically change course and move to either increase sampling or go back to some residential sampling if we do detect something. So that's why the monitoring wells are staying and proceeding until any remediation of the entire plume is done.
It's a little thought. One is, I come back to the 2024 data, that the ELM 1001, that's halfway between the plume and the
Yeah, yep, yeah, it's right here.
Right, and so if it's there, you know, is there a finger coming off that plume? Is it from another source? We don't know. And the second thing is, just hold it. I have to come back to that.
No, so that 24 sampling is, I would say it was low results, but it's questionable if that is real. So one result, I still believe that there was some questionable information about is that D&T really there? So sometimes the D&T process of sampling over these many decades realizes that not every time is it right at these low detections. So these were not enforcement standard. I believe these were not enforcement standard exceedances. They were between the PAL and the enforcement standard. But I do remember getting the results. I'm like, this doesn't seem to work. We have not found anything to the north in this well nest to show that the plume would be sliding to the south yet, but that would definitely be something we're going to mention if we start to see something like that in the future. And so we did not find, during 25, we did not find any D&T down in this area in these monitoring wells.
Well, it's there, an interpretation of it. I still maintain we need more data to continue that. And if you follow the arrow from the ELN 1001 well nest, and you follow the area for the groundwater flow, it points right at it.
Yeah, I have an arrow, yeah, right there.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to say, and I think Steve Alex said this many times, and this is years ago in the RAB meeting, and the only way to know what's in somebody's drinking water well is to test that well. You can have a monitoring well in your front yard and a drinking water well in your backyard, and it can be completely different results. And I can't emphasize too is we're kind of looking at a period where everything's static. We're not introducing anything into the water table. And so to have comprehensive data, not just what's happening at the plant boundary, but what's happening off-site in the residential areas. So that's my comment as a community member.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about this slide? In case anyone else had any. So we are still planning. I had mentioned about the nitrocellulose plume. So this is on site. We have identified with the DNR a need to install some monitoring wells on the southern end of the plume. There was a monitoring well down here, I believe, might have even been 20, I'm trying to think, it's been over 10 years. And so that was a well that got abandoned at the time because there was a huge push for abandoning a whole bunch of monitoring wells. And at the time, the NC plume wasn't as big of a deal. And so unfortunately, there was a well down here that had been abandoned. So we're looking at putting one in down there to make sure that we can say where the NC plume is in the down gradient portion. So down here, as this plume migrated any further, the DNR said, well, you guys don't really know where it is anymore. And I said, yeah, I can agree. We just keep drawing the line where it is. So the intention is to find out where it is down there. And then to the north, we still have enforcement standards exceedances at the north end for DNT. And so we're looking at putting a well into the north to evaluate if there is still DNT further or not. There's a lot of production buildings that used to be up in here, and there were DNT detections in soil during those remediations. So lots of different soil samples were collected, and they were finding DNT because it was put into the manufacturing process within this portion of the plant. So this is why it's very possible why we have this small plume here related to nitrocellulose. So I will say is that at this point, there is no contracted work with us. There are some wells planned in the future by the Army to provide SpecPro with funding to drill. But at the moment, we don't have any particular plan. We'll tell you when we will be drilling wells, but at the moment, I can't say it'll even be this year that any of these monitoring wells we're talking about will go in. So we're hopeful we'll be able to get some in the next year, and then maybe a year or two after if there's more funding for any of these monitoring wells. And then we still are proposing in the propellant burning ground to install these 3 wells. We've probably said at a few meetings down by the dam. We've been working with the property division for Alliant Energy, and they have been difficult to agree to the conditions by the Army, or they have their other conditions, and so we're still at an impasse. We've been trying to get this for a couple of years now. And so we're going to keep trying again with the Army Corps of Engineers property to try to figure out how to, once the wells are there, it's pretty simple. The people at the dam are pretty easy to work with. It's just their property people have very specific rules. So those are still out there in the future to see what's going on into the river. And I have shown something like this map before. So there's red dots. Circles where, so this is the winding subdivision over here. We have 8 monitoring wells that used to be sampled in the past, and we are going to increase to start testing those now. They haven't been sampled for quite 5 years, I think. And so we're going to increase these. The plume is still shifting a little bit further to the east. So as we've been monitoring it, over the last 20 years, there's been a continual shift left. And so we're also increasing monitoring wells off to the east on the site here that are existing. So if you're looking at wondering where the settling ponds is, Final Creek runs off to the side, if you're watching here, and then it runs through right where these wells on either side, and then Final Creek is done in settling pond 1, 2, 3, and 4. So some of these wells are still south of the settling ponds, some of them are north. The main purpose, though, is to monitor the propellant burning ground plume, but a caveat is that we're still monitoring wells down gradient of the settling ponds, which was a requirement for site closure. So the site was closed back for the settling ponds in the onus that remediation, or I should say, sampling of wells would continue under the groundwater monitoring program. So that was how the site was closed as the settling ponds. So there are still monitoring wells down gradient of the settling ponds that are being sampled, even with this plan for the propellant burning ground. And we're going to increase some testing down at the source area. There's 3 wells there. They have been clean in the past, but we want to make sure we have that boundary there. And then there's some more wells down the middle that we feel we needed to get more testing. I mean, there's a lot more monitoring wells in the plume or around the plume, but we felt like this was a good shift to adding something before any remediation was going to be going on to get some better data long term. And then on the far western edge where the plume is continuing to shift over, some of those sampling is going to be reduced frequency, not removed, but yet less frequent. Instead of semi-annual, maybe annual, or some of these over on the far east are going to be every 2 years, so we can at least get some data going from them. There's not any change in the residential testing that is going on. That had been increased in the last few years. So with the plume shifting, we've increased even some of the deeper wells. So if this ethyl ether that's down by the bedrock, if the plume is shifting more towards the east, we've increased some of those wells, like the co-op, they have a bedrock well. There's a farm, they have a bedrock well. We've increased that, and that's up by 78 and Z. There's another bedrock well across the street from there before the windings, and we've increased in testing that well. And once we evaluate anything with these monitoring wells that get retested again, clearly if there's something that needs to be concerned about with the windings residents, those wells, then we'd reevaluate that testing. But we are still testing a couple wells nearby there that had some issues in the past with carbon tet, or maybe there was some DNT detections out there. In the past, we have had some ethyl ether in some of these near bedrock wells within the windings, so we're definitely going to be doing DNT and VOCs to evaluate any of those concentrations, even though it's not specifically associated with the plume of propellant burning ground. So for some new people, they may have never heard this before, but there are detections of contamination from Badger out in this windings area going way back 20 some years ago that does not connect directly to this side of the plume. So once we get some of the sampling results from an entire round of this, we'll definitely be informing people about what kind of results we're getting. We did do all of these wells in 2020 for one round, I think it was, and so we at least had some more recent data. We tested all of the wells in the propellant burning ground plume once.
Even the ones you haven't been testing?
Yeah, we did do it one time. That we used a lot of that data to help with the proposed plan, the remedial investigation, making all the maps. So that was a request that we had made to try to add. It was like 100 extra monitoring wells that that quarter to do. So we use some of that information to help develop where we're going to look at now to try to change the sampling program. So if it's shifting east, we want to be out in front of that with the wells that we already have. So we don't have to put in more wells in that area, just use existing for now. I know you may have some questions about that area.
Has there ever been any detects on any of those wells?
Those monitoring wells? In the past, there had been, we had a little bit of carbon tetrachloride. There's been some ethyl ether. I believe there was some DNT detections in the past. Even like when the well, I mean, the wells have been there quite a while, so maybe even 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah, I know.
It's been a while.
That's the end of the regular groundwater update. Sorry for the length, but any other groundwater questions right away?
I have a question if I could. If you wouldn't mind going back to slide number 6, the residential well testing.
Oh, August.
I don't remember the date. And I just have been sitting here thinking about the 4 families or 4 residents that have PAL exceedances in their wells. And I'm wondering if you could just remind me and the group, when they get these results, do they get them in the mail? Do you send, how do they learn about this? The PAL exceedances in their residential wells?
Yeah, so Luke gets the results and then he mails them a letter. We individually talk to, because we're testing them, and so we're setting up when the sampling is, and so we're, either calling them on the phone, or one person we have to go inside of their home to test. And so I've had many conversations over the years since either they've moved in or switched residences about what the results are looking at. And so people will either call me or some, it depends on where they live, but we're constantly trying to explain to them what it is that we're finding. Because it's been very slowly increasing, like those 2 wells that you see, the carbon tetrachloride. We see the same thing in the monitoring wells that are being sampled straight to the north, that are right as you go through the gate to go towards the settling ponds. We have wells that are strung out along the fence line. And so we're seeing the exact same thing before the residential wells, because they're spaced out at those intervals. And so we are already prepared that, okay, we're seeing these VOCs that are migrating towards them. But, of course, none of the concentrations that we're seeing up gradient are enforcement standards. So it's PAL exceedances. So yeah, we've had discussions about the idea about when you get DNT, it's not very far away before you get an enforcement standard, but for something like carbon tetrachloride, 5 parts per billion is the cleanup standard for the enforcement standard, and it's 0.5 for the PAL. So once you reach the PAL, it's been, I don't even think it's at 1. It's been very slow, but it's still like, when I look at a graph, it's still trending up. And so that's why we know the plume is constantly moving over. And so it's unfortunate that at the moment, there's nothing legally, right, that we can do as the Army to replace their well at this moment. That's something we're discussing about, if it will exceed how long or what that means. But so those are the 2 wells that Luke asked at the DNR that we sample more frequently.
Do you get feedback from the residents? I mean, are they worried?
Some people ask questions about the certain contaminants that are newer, that maybe they're newer to that home.
And then I'm curious too, if these families would be able to get information on the health concerns potentially with carbon tet and chloroform? And would they go to DNR, the Division of Health? I mean, how can we help these people get information so they can make decisions for themselves?
Luke, I don't know if your letters give them any of that, or?
I don't, but we could certainly look into giving them some information. There's probably links on DNR's website and
Yeah.
DHS's website on carbon
I
tax.
just think it would be a good thing to do so that people can be informed and empowered as to, I know that we can't force the Army to do anything about it because it's not a, enforcement standard, but I'm just thinking if those were my wells, I'd be asking those questions. And I'd be wondering, should I be drinking this? Even though, technically it's, there's nothing you guys can do about it. But I think the more information we can give to people, probably the better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alrighty, now to the project management updates. So for the proposed plan for the site-wide groundwater, as mentioned in the previous meetings, that the Army is still considering in conducting the bench and pilot scale testing of the proposed emulsified vegetable oil, the EVO. But as mentioned before, it's subject to availability of funding. Just as a reminder, the consideration to conduct a bench and pilot test was based on comments that we received from you all during the public comment period for the proposed plan. Since the last RAB meeting in July, the Army has provided those responses to those comments received, and we have distributed that to the RAB members. And we are still working on to including those comments into the administrative records, and hopefully we will have that completed very soon. I will pause there for any questions on the regarding that topic. All right, so next on will be the Gruber Grove Bay data gap investigation, where the Army has been conducting characterizations of the bay to assist with future remedial actions. And as you can see from the timelines, that in December 12th, the Army submitted our responses, one of the many responses back to DNR on their comments. And as of last week, actually, the DNR has provided their approval of those comments. So we will be sending the final copy to the DNR pretty soon, if it hasn't happened already, I think probably yesterday. And the next step out of this would be that feasibility studies would be completed in the future years. I will pause there if anybody has any questions on that particular topic. And then the...
You said DNR has accepted comments. Get some clarification on that?
Yes, last week we received the approval from the DNR in accepting the comments that we provided to them in the December 12th submittal that the Army provided.
So you're agreeing to the recommendations from Army? Or from DNR, sorry? Like compliance with groundwater standards, et cetera?
No, this is for the Gruber Grove Bay investigation, data gap investigation report.
Oh, it's specific to Gruber Grove Bay, all right.
Yes, sorry about that. For the PFAS remedial investigation, we've been planning to try to do the RI work for a while. It has been snagged by the lack of funding to do that. We did the PASI back in November 2022, and since then, we have developed those contractual mechanism for us to do this RI, and we were ready to do that. And then this is where we're at. So unless there's like some plus up this year for PFAS work, unfortunately the RI will be conducted sometime either at the earliest FY27 or further out. So we will give you guys the status of that. So any questions with PFAS?
Would it help if there would be a requirement for the PFAS coming from the state, that the testing be conducted? Because if it's just, is that
In some other,
so to speak, because I know
Right.
if there is a directive from a regulatory agency, it's higher priority in funding.
it definitely doesn't hurt. And I think one of the comments that we're working on, that we received from the WDNR on the groundwater sampling plan has a little aspect of that PFAS question. So that doesn't hurt, but yes, we will, anything that we receive either from the regulators or even from the community members, we always, be very transparent with our leadership and above to make sure that those concerns or those questions are being seen.
Thank you, that's helpful.
And then for the Selling Pond site inspection, at the April RAB meeting last year, the Army presented the scope and status of the field work. And then in the July RAB meeting, we presented the general results from that sampling efforts. So since then, the Army has submitted the draft report to WDNR I believe sometime in November of last year. And the Army will plan to provide more detailed presentation at the future RAB meetings once we receive WDNR comments. And then the last thing on the, go ahead.
I don't know where I read it, and I was trying to find it, and I was unable to, but that the document said something to the effect that the DNR would have some responsibility for closure for the settling ponds, or a portion of the settling ponds, because it's already been transferred. Did I understand that correctly, or is it incorrect?
Could you, I'm not tracking that. Could you ask that one more time, Laura?
For closure of the settling ponds, which we haven't begun the investigation yet, but does the state of Wisconsin have any need or have any responsibility when it comes to any closure for that as a landowner and as a regulatory agency?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think if I understand correctly that the Settling Pond site itself was closed, and then due to an event sometime in 2020 of the burning, that kind of triggered us, the Army, to go back and relooked at the Settling Pond, and then this is where we're at in expanding that investigation.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, then one last thing, to reminder that the draft SI report is uploaded in WDNR website. Is that correct?
It's on the AC website, is it? But I know you can get to it from the main Badger page that's on the DNR Birds website.
Okay.
We're all Settling Ponds has its own site.
Okay.
It's still on there, yeah.
And for the last topic, the long-term management contract, I recall that during the last RAB meeting that the Army was in the process of developing a new contract to continue with the required landfill inspections and sampling. and also to continue with the groundwater sampling that SpecPro is conducting. So we're glad to say that not only have the Army completed that contract process, but was also able to convince and fund and award that follow-on contract in September of 2025. So that contract period of performance would be for another 5 years, and SpecPro was selected to continue with that service. So anybody else have any question on any of the project management updates? If not, I will turn this over to the next topic, which would be the USGS presentation on the groundwater flow.
I did find where that, it's actually in the minutes from the last meeting. It's on the bottom of page 4. It says, and it's referencing the propellant cranes and the silicon area. And it says, DNR is the property owner of these areas, and closure of the area will be up to them. Previous sampling at the settling ponds were more focused with less sampling locations. But that's,
It might be referring to closing.
the closure part, I didn't understand.
I wonder if by closure it means the DNR is currently looking at how to, DNR property management is looking at how to deal with that parcel with the contamination, and one of the thoughts was, do we need to close that parcel or not? So I wonder if those meeting minutes are referring to closure as closing the parcel to public access.
Right. That makes sense.
Like putting a fence around it, that kind of closing.
Yep, yeah, either a fence or additional signage, yep.
All right, now I got it, thanks.
Okay. Hi, I'm Nick Korsendosh. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I work at the Upper Midwest Water Science Center in Madison. And I'm a part of the team that has been tasked with developing a set of groundwater models to simulate the flow and transport of contamination below Badger. Today I'm going to be presenting on the summary of the USGS groundwater transport modeling study. Oops. So the update we'd like to provide today is that we're essentially at the conclusion of our work. We've completed a groundwater flow and transport model that simulates the movement of groundwater and contaminants at Badger. And this is part of a bigger study that we've been involved with for the last several years. The first phase of our work that we've presented on in the past, maybe you have memories of us up here presenting, related to the groundwater flow model. And so the current part of our modeling focuses on the transport of contamination, but it all started with the groundwater flow model. And that work sought to characterize the groundwater flow system at Badger, answering specific questions like where is the groundwater moving, how does groundwater interact with below the site and with the Wisconsin River, and how does the flow of groundwater control and influence the movement of the plume. And that work is all described in a report that's shown here on the slide and available for the public along with the groundwater flow model. And so our second phase of modeling is the one I'll be talking about tonight, relates to the modeling of contaminant transport at the site. And so the first phase of modeling, the groundwater flow model, is really the foundation for the transport modeling. And I'll talk a bit more about the transport model now. So that sort of brings up the question is, what is a groundwater transport model and how is it different from a groundwater flow model? While a groundwater flow model simulates the movement of groundwater, both how it enters the ground, how it's stored in the aquifers, and how it exits the flow system, a groundwater transport model uses a different set of mathematical equations to represent how the contamination moves through the groundwater system and how it interacts with the aquifer materials. And so then what were the goals for our contaminant transport model at Badger? Our goal was to develop a tool that could be used to answer specific questions that are relevant to the cleanup objectives at Badger. For example, Where is the contamination most likely to be, and are the current monitoring wells in the right places to track it? Questions like, what might the contamination look like in the future, potentially 20 years from now? And questions like, if a bioremediation treatment was used, how much could it reduce the contamination? So I'm going to talk briefly about our process for developing the transport models, and then I'll talk a bit about the results. So our initial step in developing these transport models was to build sort of an initial best guess set of models. And the models that we decided to develop were for the contaminants of concern that had the longest monitoring histories at the site. So that includes 2,4-DNT, 2,6-DNT, TCE, and looked specifically at the plumes that extended off-site. So that's the PBG, the central plume, and the DBG. The next step was to incorporate field data from the site into our model and to improve the model through a process called history matching. So we're essentially taking our model and tuning the dials of that model so that the outputs from the model better match the actual field data that was measured at the site. And so the result of the history matching process is an updated set of models that better reflect the observed data from the site. And so that sounds like a pretty simple process, but there's kind of a mathematical challenge in history matching a transport model. Because there are so many different factors that influence the way the contamination moves through groundwater, it means that we have to use lots of parameters, which each parameter kind of represents each of those factors. And when you have lots of parameters, it means that there are lots of different possible combinations of parameters that can produce plausible outputs. And so this problem in modeling is called non-uniqueness. So you can have all of these different unique combinations of parameters that give you similar results. And so it's not really possible to have a single set of calibrated parameters that give you a single right result, because each of these parameters is uncertain. And so a way to overcome this challenge of non-uniqueness is, instead of using a single set of parameters, you sample a big range, or you have an ensemble of parameters. So a big collection of models, essentially, that instead of getting a single result that you consider your best result, you have a collection of results that you consider the range of possible outcomes. And so that's the approach that we used in our modeling. And so that sounds a little bit abstract, so I'll try to show a few examples to kind of explain what I mean. So there are 4 different things on this particular slide. There are 2 charts and 2 maps. The charts show concentration histories at specific wells for 2,4-DNT, and the maps show the location of those wells at Badger. So the top chart shows the concentration histories at well PBM 0008, which is near the source area of the PBG. The black line and the white dots represent the actual measured concentrations, and the green lines represent the modeled concentrations. And so you can kind of see this cluster of lines that sort of overlaps and envelops that measured history of concentrations. And it does a reasonable job of matching it, but some uncertainty remains both high and low. And that's kind of what you expect, given that the parameters themselves are uncertain. So you're kind of sampling the range around the true values. And then we can also look at a different well, this second well, which is SWN 9104C, which is in the downgradient portion of the PBG plume, also showing 2,4-DNT. And so there you can see majority of the models that represent our collection of models have pretty good agreement, but not all of them do. But that represents the uncertainty that remains in the model. And so we can also compare wells, similar wells looking at 2,6-DNT from our model. So we kind of see a similar story where the range of model outcomes kind of envelops the true values. And then we can see similar outcomes if we look at TCE, and these are different wells, but both in the PBG. And so we kind of get a sense for the way that our model is able to sort of represent the real values, but retains a certain amount of uncertainty. And so we can also use then the model outputs to look at things like the probability that a given area in the model will exceed a certain concentration threshold. And one of the relevant concentration thresholds that we've been talking about already in this meeting is the PAL, the preventative action limit. And what our model can look at is both the PAL for TCE and for total DNT, which are relevant to the cleanup objectives at the site. And so this plot shows the probability that the that predicts will exceed the total DNT PAL at the end of the history matching period. And so there's a few things going on in this figure. I'll try to describe them each. So the orange polygons are the total DNT PAL from SpecPro's 2024 site-wide monitoring or site-wide groundwater report. And so these are the 2023 PAL contours for total DNT. Behind those, you see these colored zones, and those are the probability areas simulated by the model. And so it's important to point out that these aren't the concentrations simulated by the model, but these are the exceedance probabilities. So the probability that there will be concentrations above that PAL threshold. And so the darker areas represent higher probabilities, and the lighter areas represent slightly lower probabilities. And so we can kind of see how the modeling results line up with what with what SpecPro has mapped for their PAL. And we see that in the PBG, we have a reasonably good match. We have higher probabilities near the source areas and decreasing areas that sort of follow the flow of groundwater to the Wisconsin River. The DBG as well does a reasonably good job, particularly at the source area, but kind of fans out pretty wide, which kind of reflects some of the uncertainty about the direction of the flow field in that area. The flow field's pretty flat, so there's some uncertainty among our collection of models about which direction exactly the plume is going through that region. The central plume is reasonably good near the source area, in particular kind of the area that defines the enforcement standard portion of that plume, but really doesn't simulate concentrations in the down gradient portion near Gruber's Grove Bay. So that's definitely a limitation of the central plume simulated by the model. And so the process of developing these probability areas is kind of defined in the first three numbers on this slide. And then a bit of detail about potential reasons for the limitations in the central plume are listed. There's relatively small amounts of data in the down gradient portions of that plume that could be used for the history matching, also for establishing kind of the initial plume conditions of the central plume. And the source area of the central plume is a little bit uncertain as well, so it's difficult to know that where mass is entering the system in the central plume is being represented correctly in the model. So ultimately, this probability type of map can be used as one of the ways to assess the monitoring well network to see if the coverage meets all of the cleanup objectives. We can also look at the probability exceedance for the TCE simulated by the model, and that lines up quite well with the contours mapped by SpecPro from the site-wide groundwater report. So once we had a collection of models that reasonably matched the observed data, we can then use those models to look into the future and look at conditions under different remedial scenarios. So one of the first questions that comes up is how might the DNT plumes look in 20 years without any remediation? So this is a simulated natural attenuation scenario. So that's where there's no intervention, where the plumes are allowed to continue into the future. And the left plume represents the end of our history matched model, which is approximately 2020. And then the center figure is in 2040. So that's 20 years beyond that. And we can kind of see that ultimately the plumes look somewhat similar. So there's not a lot of change if you just project directly into the future. And the third plot shows the change in probability. So if you subtract one from the other, where do you have higher probabilities, where do you have lower probabilities, and where do you have similar probabilities? So the similar probability areas are the yellow zones. The green zones are lower probability, so particularly down gradient in the PBG, there's lower probability of exceeding the PAL. But just down gradient of the source areas, this indicates there might be slight increases in probability of exceeding the PAL. We can then use that forecast model to try to understand the effects of bioremediation. And because we're early in the process of planning bioremediation, there's no set design yet. So to give this sort of a proof of concept analysis to show that we can use the model to kind of look at this sort of thing, we decided to use the conceptual treatment design from the proposed site-wide groundwater plan, which is shown in this figure here. So those orange lines on the left plot are from that report, showing one way that bioremediation could be implemented at the site, so in these treatment lines. And so we implemented those lines into the model, which is the model grid on the right, and implemented increased biodegradation in those zones. So then we can run the scenario forward. It's unclear how effective bioremediation will be or what the achievable biodegradation rates are at Badger, given that we haven't conducted a pilot scale test yet. So we can use the best information that's available in the literature from other sites where they've done this sort of analysis to see what the range of possible degradation rates could be. And so we can kind of formulate those into two scenarios, kind of this high effective scenario where bioremediation is really pretty effective and a scenario where it's less effective. And so we can kind of look at those both to kind of see what a range of possible outcomes could be. And so this first plot shows three things. The plot on the left is the 2040 conditions from natural attenuation, so that's no remediation at all. The center is with a highly effective bioremediation scenario, so you see the difference in shape of these probability exceedance zones. And then the figure on the right shows the difference. So these big sort of green zones, particularly with the DBG and the central plume, show that there's likely to be a decrease in probability exceeding the PAL in those areas. And then the PBG is somewhat similar, but has a decrease sort of along the area where, if you can see in this figure, bioremediation was implemented. So it's effective where it's being treated. We can also look at our less effective scenario. So let's say that bioremediation is happening in those areas, but the effectiveness is lower. And you can see that there's a reduced effectiveness in the reduction of the plume exceedance probability. So there is some benefit, but not as much. And that's interesting to look at, particularly the way it's distributed within the plumes and where you still maybe have some benefits. And so to try to quantify, to help us understand exactly how much benefit you get from these different levels of effectiveness, you can actually look at how much mass is removed as a result of bioremediation over that 20-year forecast period. And then we can look at 5-year increments to see how much mass is lost by the plume from bioremediation. And we find that in our two scenarios, the high remediation compared to the low remediation, you can remove about 5 times more DNT from the plumes, under a highly effective remediation scenario. Yeah, sure.
This is a question that others I know in the room have.
Yes.
Could you go back to the simulation? That one, yeah.
Sure.
Could you explain, I know there's limitations about DNT degradation, trust me, I've researched that myself.
Sure.
Could you explain what the pilot test or what some of those parameters are that create the middle of doing remediation, but it doesn't look like it did much, right? That's probably what, yeah, that's what I could tell. I was like, oh, I know Michelle's saying something in her head, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because it's the middle one that says, hey, there was some remediation, but it's not very noticeable.
Right. So there are assumptions obviously baked into these. One of the assumptions shown here is that there is continued source loading. There's a few steps to getting to this future model, and one of the assumptions is that conditions from the past are held constant into the future. One of the things that our history matching required is that some small amount of source loading was needed at the source areas to sort of sustain the concentrations we see at wells on site. And so what this future projection includes is some continuous loading from the source zone. And so with continuous loading, you sustain those particular source areas of each of the plumes. They're not going to go away. The treatment zones are all slightly down gradient from the sources, and so we continue to see those sources. They don't disappear. Not shown here, and what will be in the report is another set of scenarios without source loading. And those look quite a bit different. And that's kind of the other end of the spectrum of possibilities, where if there isn't any additional source loading and you do bioremediation, the plumes look much smaller than this even. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's probably some amount of source loading, but The nature of the source loading is pretty uncertain, whether or not there's small amounts kind of trickling at a consistent rate, or if it's episodic, maybe certain conditions cause spiking, which I think has been shown to be likely the case in the PBG, where the water table rises and intersects contaminated areas of soil. So likely the truth is somewhere in the middle. I guess the rates at which degradation will happen are also highly uncertain. There are a few studies that have reported rates of degradation, but there are many factors that kind of influence what's achievable. And so a pilot test would help us get a better handle on what's realistic at Badger. And we could, in turn, put those rates back into the model and kind of revise our estimates based on what we expect to be likely here in the aquifer under Badger.
Yeah, too, in the less effective and the more effective maps there, you know, usage as the ton happens in pretty substantial improvements, and that's where the pilot study kind of tells you what one of those is going to be more likely.
Yeah. And
Just, you know, they can't hear
okay.
You can repeat it.
Would you mind saying it again?
Yeah, that was just-
do a good job.
Oh, just that one of the real values of the pilot study is these are two really different pictures because we had to use these literature ranges and we don't really know how effective these microbes will be able to break down DNT. And that's why we kind of have these two end members. And so the pilot study kind of helps you understand where you might be. Are you going to be kind of on the more effective end, the less effective end, or maybe somewhere in between?
Yeah. And it seems clear to us anyway that highly, I guess, very quick degradation is possible at Badger. In areas where there have been spikes, you see rapid decreases. And so when concentrations are high, it seems like there are the right conditions to degrade high concentrations quickly. It can be more difficult, it seems, to degrade low concentrations, which kind of have why you see these long tails, particularly in DNT, that extend out. So that the rate of degradation does change depending on the concentration of the contaminant and, you know, lots of other factors, the chemistry of the aquifer, where it is along the flow path. So there are a lot of different factors that might be considered by the pilot study and try to paint a better picture of what's possible in a remediation setup. Sure.
A couple questions, one from Mike Sharon. You mentioned the model accounts for interactions with the material through which it passes. How are you modeling mechanisms such as absorption and matrix diffusion?
Yeah, so the model represents sorption. Okay, adsorption, okay. So we represent sorption, I guess is the term we typically, I guess, have been using internally for our modeling. Using linear sorption, we have an assumed organic content of the soil based on literature values at other sites and of similar soils. I guess we don't have specific organic carbon concentrations from the aquifer materials here at Badger, but you can get a sense for what the amount of sorption is likely to be based on the organic content of the soils. A lot of these are pretty clean, homogeneous outwash sand, so there's pretty low organic carbon content. So sorption is likely to be relatively small. We don't have a lot of matrix diffusion as well, and we haven't really represented that in the model here. Although from just testing, we have noticed that the amount of sorption that happens in the upper layers seems to be somewhat important for the results that the model produces. So that's sort of a sensitive property that might be one of the things we continue to look at in the treatability study, exactly what the carbon content is in the top layers of the aquifer.
Steph, excuse me for butchering your name, Town Merrimack. Slide 33 shows over a period of 20 years, assuming more effective bioremediation, that the decrease in probability exceeding PAL is still mostly within Badger. How long is it projected until the increases will be seen in the residential areas that have seen PAL exceedances?
Yeah, let's see. I think part of the reason why that this shows less decreases, let's see, I guess, I don't have the laser pointer going on the trackpad. Oh, the mouse does it. Okay, great. So like in this region, for example, why there isn't maybe a decrease shown is that the original probabilities are already relatively low. And so the change is small. It's maybe from a small number to another small number. So maybe it's just not shown in this particular definition of a decrease, but probabilities in this part of the plume would be pretty low if we could zoom in here. I think maybe that's one of the regions that you're talking about potentially. I think you might see bigger decreases in this part of the plume, in the central plume, depending on the configuration of the remediation setup. So the bioremediation lines that we tested in the PBG were sort of this narrow band along the west side of the plume. And so if these were wider, we might see broader decreases in the PBG as well. Okay, any other questions I can address now? Sure.
Answered it.
Okay.
I find it just curious that the prevalent burning ground plume doesn't look like it's gonna change much, even with effective bioremediation.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the way the bioremediation lines were implemented in our test. And this is meant to be kind of a proof of concept. So we came up with just this one configuration of bioremediation that was in the site-wide groundwater report. And this kind of demonstrates how the model can be used to kind of iterate over different design possibilities, and maybe we see that this sort of narrow band doesn't get the parts of the plume we want it to get, and so we could maybe move it slightly to the east, or we could extend, you know, the width of those treatment lines. This is kind of how we envision the tool being used as kind of like a way to kind of test these different designs, essentially. And so this might be one of the good takeaways, is that, you know, potentially the test that we ran doesn't have the outcome that we would hope for. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Laura, you want to go ahead? James, can you unmute her? Laura, can you mute yourself?
I was gonna have a comment and a question about when you're tracking DNTs, you're looking at the total DNT and then the 2.4 and the 2.6. And one of the things we know is, for example, the propellant burning ground, the preponderance of DNT that's present historically has been 2.4 and 2.6 and very low levels of the lesser isomers. But the deterrent burning ground, in many cases, the opposite is true. In fact, when we were only testing for 2.4 and 2.6, it didn't look like there was a problem in certain wells. But then when it switched to, we had the capacity to test for, and methods to test for all 6 of the isomers, what we're seeing in the groundwater there is the 2.3, the 3.4, et cetera, of the 2.4 and 2.6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
so. If there was, I did ask about this in the last iteration of study that was done, and at that time it wasn't a possibility. But I think in terms of projecting forward, I think having specific consideration of those other isomers is important, because I think it's 2.3 or 3.4, I can't remember for certain, is used as a tracer because it doesn't want to break down in the presence of the other ones. So that's just something I wanted to put out there. If there was some way to take that data and make it appear, you know, in a map kind of form, where you could see, are they all acting the same way within the groundwater?
Mm-hmm.
You follow me?
I do, yeah. And that's a really good point that, that I've been thinking about, and is potentially one of the reasons why in this particular figure, the down gradient portions of the plumes are underrepresented. It might be because in the central plume and the DBG and the central plume, there may be more of those isomers present. And what's really shown here is our approximation of total DNT by summing 2,4 and 2,6, but it's missing the other isomers. And so that might, in fact, bolster the down gradient portions of the central plume, and it might increase the down gradient portions of the DBG as well. We hadn't included those isomers because there was just less data, particularly in the early part of our simulation period. We wanted to include, I guess, the longest possible history that we could match our model, tune our model to, allows us, I guess, kind of gives us the best opportunity to tune the transport parameters for those contaminants. And so because those other COCs have shorter histories, it wasn't really possible to calibrate to those. We could still try to simulate those given their current distributions. We could guess at their transport properties and assume based on the properties you described that maybe there isn't much degradation happening of those and see what those total DNT plumes might look like. I think it's outside of the current scope, but potentially after the treatability study, there may be opportunities to come back and revise the model with the additional data that's found by the treatability study.
Just for the badger community, but there's, if you look at EPA website for fact sheets on denitrotality, there's this consistent, every document that you read almost says technical grade DNT has, 98% 2,4 and 2,6. But what we're finding is if you look at the groundwater, the Sauk-Prairie ground, that's not the case at all. You have wells that just have the lesser isomers and no 2,4 and 2,6. So I think if you would pursue it, I think it would be useful to a lot of communities because we've spent many years talking to other communities, especially other Army ammunition plants, and say you need to look for all of them because you can miss a lot, especially when you're trying to determine risk to public health. Because some of them they have a boosting effect. Two of them, they have more than an additive effect, but a synergistic effect when you have for health, when you have multiple isomers. So whenever I get the opportunity and you guys are doing this kind of work, I think we could help a lot of communities by providing data that shows at least one example of how if you only look at these certain parameters, which the majority only look at 2,4 and 2,6, it's very unusual what we have here at BAAP. And I don't know who was behind all of that momentum that we got, but much of it was not even ordered by regulators. It was something that Army started doing at Badger. So anyway, I just wanted to. So I think it's great what you're doing, but I just wanted to put that out there so you're thinking about going forward and actually looking at the treatability, these pilot tests, how we measure that. And I know this is not a regular, total DNT as a driver, but I'm thinking that the science behind this could impact how we set standards for different contaminants. But thank you for listening and your presentation. I appreciate it.
No, thanks. Thanks for your comments. Good one. Okay. So I think I ended here. So just now to summarize kind of the takeaways from our modeling effort. Our model leverages information from field data and provides a comprehensive estimate of groundwater contamination at Badger. Model outputs can be helped to assess things like the monitoring well network design and the likelihood of contamination in areas that are not currently being sampled. The model accounts for prediction uncertainty, which enables risk-based decisions. We also find that some continued amount of source loading was needed to match the observed field concentrations in the model. And so with continued source loading the indication is that there is the possibility that the plumes may persist or redevelop. Like I already mentioned, the nature of that source loading is pretty uncertain and might be something worthy of additional study in the future. More certainty, the model also has more uncertainty in the central plume and potentially also parts of the DBG for the reasons we just discussed. Limited data in the central plume and also potentially the emission of those other lesser DNT isomers. And some takeaways from the remediation scenarios. Without treatment, according to our simulations, there will likely be minimal reductions in the footprints over the 20-year simulation period. And this is, I guess, dependent on the assumptions made about source loading. The outcomes of bioremediation treatment is also dependent on the degradation rates that are achieved by the system, and a pilot study could provide better estimates about what this rate is likely to be at Badger. And finally, the proof of concept example that we provided shows that the model could be a tool that could be used to help in the design of the bioremediation system and help optimize system layouts or assess potential outcomes of bioremediation. And so our report has gone through our internal USGS review process, and we've received those comments back. We're in the process of responding to those comments. And so the next step will be that the report goes to our internal publication team, and the report, along with the models, will be released to the public in the coming months. So, that's the update. I'm happy to take any additional questions if there are any related to the modeling. Thanks.
If I could.
Yeah.
Which of the plumes are you most concerned about with the continued source loading?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. I guess we could go back to the probability maps. To be honest, they're all somewhat uncertain. I mean, the amounts of source that remain. The spiking observed in the PBG might indicate there's a certain amount of mass that's above the water table and below the caps that maybe isn't actively leaching because it's protected by the caps, but may exist somewhere in that unsaturated zone. There's maybe 90 or 100 feet of unsaturated soil, and a certain amount of that was excavated in the past in remediation, but not all 100 or 90 feet of it. So there may be a certain amount there. The central plume in the model anyhow it's pretty uncertain where the source is or if there's a source. And so the representation of the central plume source area could be better resolved, at least for the model. I think those are kind of the two areas of uncertainty related to source areas in the model.
And if you could do continued studying on that, what would that look like?
I'm not entirely sure at this point. It would be, I guess, one opportunity for additional work would depend on the treatability study, and if there are refined biodegradation rates that are likely at Badger, we could incorporate those into our forecast models and come up with kind of refined estimates for that forecast period. And this could be extended, and we could also continue to iterate with whoever is conducting the bioremediation over the design. So we could edit these bioremediation configurations essentially to test other layouts. So I think those are kind of the two big things. We could refine transport parameters given what's learned in a treatability study, and we could continue to work with whoever's designing the bioremediation system to kind of test different layouts. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Is now exiting.
So that brings us to the conclusion of tonight's RAB meeting. Just a reminder that the future RAB meetings is the next one would be in April 16th of this year, and then you can see the rest of the dates that we will be back on our quarterly schedule. So with that being said, any follow-up questions or, and as always, if you have any questions that you think of later, feel free to email me as always. Other than that, we really appreciate your coming out tonight and look forward to the next RAB meeting. Thank you, everybody.